Hey, and we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage, porn-free, civilly disobedient media. We are here in Jamestown, Rhode Island. It is a spectacular Rhode Island day. This is the day, well, days like this is why we live here, quite frankly. And a beautiful working harbor behind us. To my left, you can't see it on camera, of course, is the Newport Bridge. And I have the privilege here of being, again, with a congressional candidate, Don Carlson. Editorial note, we are reaching out to have these kind of conversations with every candidate. What's fascinating to me is who's saying yes, and no one ever says no, but let's just say they find ways to avoid deep policy conversations. We're talking about foreign policy today, and lost in the haze and the Sturm und Drang of Rhode Island politics is the notion that this is a federal office, and while attention to issues like education, issues like social justice, issues like federal engagement in a variety of transfer payment and welfare programs is a critical part of the conversation. The United States Congress occupies obviously a critical role in our foreign policy. David Cicilline, Jack Reed, Sheldon Whitehouse are all involved at very high levels, as is Seth Magaziner as he makes his entree into Congress. So it's critical to have these conversations so that we, number one, understand that the people we are electing actually have a working knowledge of it before they get to Congress. This isn't city council, this isn't the state house. This is very much the real world. And we were discussing off camera with the candidate, sometimes a nuances, a few different words, a posturing can have broad impact on foreign policy. So let's get down to it. Candidate Carlson, thanks again for joining us. What's developing is that your campaign openness to a variety of conversations appears to be profoundly different from most of your competitors. Just yesterday, Steve Ahlquist from the Substack, steveahlquist.com, actually had an in-depth conversation with you about renewables and about the environment. So let's get right to it. Talk to us, if you will, and we're going to have to ask you to use the outside voice a little bit, but talk to us about where you see the United States' role in world affairs, foreign policy, war, statesmanship.
It's a good question. And first of all, Pat, thank you very much for having me this morning. Yeah, I'm happy to be here this morning. I love being in Jamestown. This is where I grew up and lived, and this was Mr. B's Deli when I was a little kid, and this would be the only place you could buy discounted tokens for the Newport Bridge, which was pretty interesting. So we often were down here for coffee in the mornings when I was growing up. So it's a privilege to be with you today. I know we spent a day at Quonset together, which was fun. We talked a lot about international trade when we were at Quonset, and I know that you came and saw us for our first day of canvassing up in Barrington, which was really a lot of fun as well when I got endorsed by Carl Costell. So I appreciate how closely you've been paying attention, and it's always good to work with a member of the press who's tuned in and very literate about all the issues. To answer your question, though, I do see the U.S. as having a dominant role in world affairs, and I think one of the key things is the United States is the leader of the free world. We are what most of the world thinks of first when they think about democracy and democratic values. And I think we have an obligation to live into that. So the first thing I'd say is, at home, we ought to make sure that we are that, what Ronald Reagan used to call that shining city on a hill, or as close to it as we can be. We ought to be constantly perfecting our own democracy, constantly making our own style more democratic, over the course of time so that we can be a beacon to the rest of the world. And we've got work to do on that. It's a journey. Secondly, when we then have that role in society, or in the world society, the world civilization, then we have an obligation to extend that franchise to the rest of the world and to support and defend freedom where it exists all around the world. And a case in point, I think, sort of echoing President Kennedy here, to pay any price, bear any burden to support the spread of freedom around the world and the spread of democracy around the world. I think right now we have a live case in Ukraine. And fortunately we have people in Ukraine who are willing to fight for freedom, their own freedom and our freedom, and willing to stand on the front lines and defend freedom against tyranny in the form of the Russian invasion and occupation of their country. And I'm really proud of the Biden administration for aggressively supporting that initiative and for providing Ukraine with the tools and sometimes the weapons that they need to take care of their people, but also to fight this war on behalf of all free countries everywhere. So I think that's a good example of how the U.S. can actually represent itself in the world. Listen, we've had a rough history. in a lot of cases. Sometimes our interventions have been ill-advised. Sometimes we take our power for granted. Sometimes we help where we aren't wanted. But I think in Ukraine we have a pretty unambiguous case of where we should help, and we are helping, and I'm really proud of that for the U.S. In other parts of the world, take Israel for example, I'm a little frustrated in this campaign that we haven't talked a little bit more about Israel. I think it's really important for every single candidate in this race to clearly identify their relationship to Israel and how they feel about it and how they want to either protect and defend Israel or be a nudge towards Israel to take the other point of view. I've come down really clearly on that one in that I'm a big fan of Israel. I'm a strong supporter of the Israeli state and the idea that Israel has a right to exist. I think we're really lucky to have such a reliable democratic ally in that part of the world. They provide us with all kinds of great intelligence. My closest friend is Jim Himes, who's in the House of Representatives right now. I'm looking forward to going to work with him down there. And Jim is on the Intelligence Committee. He's the ranking Democrat on the Intelligence Committee. So he's in the G8, the group that gets briefed on all the covert actions all around the world and all the drone strikes and all that kind of stuff. And I sleep better at night knowing that Jim has that job because I trust and believe in him so deeply, and I know he's such a man of integrity. At the same time, he tells me sometimes we'd be up the creek if we didn't have Israel's intelligence service providing us a steady stream of information that keeps America safe. So I think for all those reasons, yesterday the president of Israel spoke to the United States Congress. Some people in my own party boycotted that speech. I understand they planned to boycott it. I don't know if they went through with it. Actually, I didn't read the paper this morning yet. But they plan to boycott it. And I think that's frankly unconscionable. I think we should be standing by Israel as a loyal, democratic ally in that part of the world.
Let's talk about the Ukraine for a second. The role of NATO appears to be in part a provocateur in that, let's just say, in the Eastern Bloc or the approaches to the Eastern Bloc. Folks don't realize that the inclusion of Finland recently, and correct me if I'm wrong, geography trivia here, I believe Finland may have the largest border on that side to Soviet Union.
Oh, I think that's right. Yeah, the former Soviet Union, now Russia. Exactly.
I grew up with Brezhnev, okay?
Yeah, I hear you. Me too.
No one is going to give Putin anything remotely like an excuse for his outrageous behavior, for what I believe is at a certain attempt is a level of genocide that he's practicing in different parts of the world. But at the same time, did the move to push nations into NATO post-Cold War, post-peace dividend, remember that? Do you think accelerate, if you will, our entree into the war and the Russian invasion?
It's a good question, and it's a fair question. I have complicated feelings about this, and I don't know that there's a clear right answer, at least
Correct.
in my mind.
Yeah, of course not.
But I do think that the extension of NATO, let first take a step, NATO is a defensive alliance, right? The whole premise of the NATO treaty, Section 5, is that we will defend each other. We will treat an attack on one as an attack on all. That means if somebody attacks a NATO country, we're at war. Now, those stakes could not be higher. Mm-hmm. So I feel like we should be a little careful and a little thoughtful about who we let into NATO, given that that's the obligation we're undertaking. So, as it was correctly pointed out in the recent weeks, if we let Ukraine into NATO this week, we're instantly at war with Russia.
Right.
That's a scary thought right there.
Well, and let's go back to this sort of steady progress to war. When the invasion occurred, a lot of our efforts were humanitarian.
Right.
And it appeared that the United States was going to take a very careful, cautionary role, if you will, in the ongoing conflict. And then you start to have this sort of mission creep. And I know we talked offline about the Cohen-Powell doctrine that seems so quaint these days. Have a plan, have a reason, have an exit strategy.
Bingo. And that exit strategy is the key one.
Right. So, but we went, as we watched progress, we went to military support. And then we started to cross, some would argue, some challenging lines. To me, up until very recently, the most provocative one was our decision to not only train at Fort Sill officers from the Ukrainian Army on M1 Abrams, but to actually supply them. And then this past week, or a week and a half or so, the decision to use cluster munitions, even high-grade cluster munitions, which, interestingly enough, the United States is one of the only major nations that's not a party to the conventional cluster munitions. At what point in time the Soviet Union, right, respond because they will posture that we're directly killing Russian boys and girls.
Yeah.
How dangerous is that, and how do we balance that line?
Yeah. Well, I think the president has been doing a good job of walking up to that line and not crossing it so far. But yesterday I was asked in another context the question about cluster munitions, and I did jump off the train on that one because I feel like we should not be supplying weapons that most of the world finds a violation of the conventions of war.
Right.
So I don't think that's a good decision to do that. They're inhumane weapons to begin with. I don't want the United States' reputation associated with weapons like cluster munitions. So I think that was a mistake, frankly, to supply cluster munitions to the Ukrainian troops to use against Russians. At the same time, I'm a big supporter in general of the military help that we've given, and I think that right now Biden has, what's the old phrase, it's the dose that makes the poison. So far he's dosed it quite well, or titrated I think is the medical term, EMT training kicking in here. He's titrated the dose quite well to understand how far we can go without pushing Putin to retaliate directly against the United States. And that's a really important thing to do. I think he's done that through really skillful diplomacy and intelligence collection and trying to figure out how far he can push. And we do want to help as much as we can help without pushing over the line. I think that's the tricky issue.
Right. Let's jump to Israeli-Palestine conflict.
Sure.
And we're just going to cover a couple issues today. Time is an element. I know you've got campaign stops coming up, but critically
Always.
important is two-state solution.
Yes.
Is it alive? Is it possible? Are we dreaming at this point?
Maybe I'm tempted to say it's alive on life support, because I think we're a long way from it right now. And the core problem is not having the party to negotiate with. There isn't somebody on the other side who can speak for the Palestinian people with authority and reach a solution that's politically viable for both sides, or I should say existentially viable for both sides. And I think until Israel has a viable negotiating partner, it's really difficult to even picture what a two-state solution would look like. I mean, there have been lots of proposals over the years, right, about where the lines should be and what geography, how do we do it geographically. So maybe that's less of a problem because any proposal you pick is going to be better than the current situation. What the problem is the lack of a negotiating partner that Israel can really engage with in a cohesive way. There's been some hope, and here I'm going to actually give Donald Trump a little bit of credit because the Abraham Accords have really lessened tensions in that region. You might note this is the only time in my life I'm ever going to give Donald Trump credit for anything, so pay attention to this one. But the Abraham Accords have actually lessened tensions in the region, and they've given some of the Gulf states, anyway, an opportunity to engage with Israel on cultural levels, with cultural exchanges. I understand one of the Gulf states now actually has a synagogue in it for people to visit, which is pretty amazing. You wouldn't have imagined that 5 years ago. And so there's, I think, more Israelis going to the Gulf states than the reverse. People from the Gulf states, the Arab states, coming to Israel. But there is some cultural exchange, and that's always hopeful. When people are building ties together, and you're having, young men and women fall in love with each other across the divisions, and you're having exchanges of ideas and interesting connections and friendships that are built, that gives hope for peace in the future. So I really do think those Abraham Accords have done a good job of moving us in a good direction. But centrally, let's face it, the Arab nations for a long time have used Palestine as a prop, the Palestinian people as a prop, as a way to keep their people united against a common enemy of Israel.
Right.
And that's really unfortunate, and that's kind of what needs to fade away. And no longer use the Palestinian people as a prop that the Arab countries can fire their people up about, but instead think of them as people who need a solution and a place to live and a place to call home. And so having a homeland for Palestine, I think, for the Palestinian people rather, is a really important idea. And I think this is a question of leadership, frankly. There needs to be leadership on the Palestinian side that can say, look, we can have a better life. We can be like another Israel. I mean, we're of the same genetic stock, right? We could be like another Israel that is vibrant and growing and economically prosperous, technologically off the charts advanced beyond other countries. And there's no reason that the Palestinian people couldn't have that kind of future if they're willing to accept peace and accept an outcome that gives them a homeland within secure borders, and that requires them, first and foremost and above all else, to accept Israel's right to exist as a nation and to peacefully coexist with their neighbor.
Excellent. The next time we get together, we can talk about Iran.
Okay.
I just
I'll have to prep for that one.
I just had a flashback to what was it, Death to America Day?
Oh, yeah.
And the stunning, let's just say, absence of institutional knowledge about America's very complicated relationship with Iran going back to the 40s and 50s.
Big time. You know, when I was a freshman in college, one of my classmates was Reza Pahlavi, the crown prince of Iran. I remember one night we were.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to Williams College.
Wow.
In Western
Okay.
Massachusetts. Yep. Yeah. By the way, I grew up around here. I got an amazing scholarship from Williams that paid for me to go to 4 years of law school and 3 years of any graduate school in the world that I wanted to go to for free. And honestly, that completely changed my life. Put me on a whole different life trajectory. My goal is someday to have that for every Rhode Island kid, every boy and girl in Rhode Island growing up who can run as far and as fast as they can because they have access to that kind of education. Because it certainly changed my life, and being at Williams was a great privilege. But in my freshman year, Reza Pahlavi came and joined my class. And one night we were all watching Rocky Horror Picture Show together at the little movie theater in town. There's only one tiny little movie theater in Williamstown. And, you know, because everybody acts out the movie. You know how the culture with Rocky Horror, you know, they put the papers up in the rain and they have the toast.
Let's have a toast, yes.
And then there's one part during the rain scene where people pull out squirt guns and start shooting water in the air so they can pull out, you know, the newspapers and acting out the scene that's on screen. So in this darkened theater, all of a sudden, all of us pull out squirt guns, you know, little that looked like guns. And Reza's guards went nuts, and they all pulled out their Uzis, and everybody down on the floor, like, drop your weapons, and like, it was the craziest scene you could in a darkened movie theater. They had no idea what was going on. They didn't follow this cultural phenomenon.
I would just say Rocky Horror probably isn't big in Tehran.
No, definitely not.
Especially these
definitely
days.
Not, yeah. So it was quite a scene. I'll never forget it. But then, you know, later that same year, that was the revolution.
Right.
And Reza had to leave college because his father was dethroned and was sent into exile, justifiably, by the way. I'm not defending the Shah of Iran or our policies with respect to the Shah of Iran, but Reza was a nice guy, and he actually, to his credit, he volunteered to go home, and he was an Air Force pilot, a trained Air Force pilot. He volunteered to go home and fly for Iran in the Iran-Iraq War a couple years later, even though he knew that probably meant certain death for him to go home.
Right.
And so I always thought that was a noble gesture on his part. We only had him with us for less than a year because the revolution happened and he had other things on his mind.
An area of great misunderstanding is the prevalence of Iranian Jews within the academic and professional culture there. Until, you know, there was at some level a peaceful coexistence, and that community contributed greatly to a broad base of success. Of course, American interventionism will do that next time. Thank you for joining me today. What I like to do, I forgot to do last week, was I always give the candidates an opportunity to engage with what I lovingly call shameless self-promotion. All right. So if you can tell where folks can find you and reach you and possibly support your campaign.
Sure.
We know that you have enough signatures, so you're on the ballot.
I do. I do. All honest signatures.
All honest, and you came in third, so you're number 3.
3 on the ballot.
Three on the ballot lottery yesterday.
Very happy about that.
Oh boy.
It's funny the things that influence an election, right? Those things you can never. It's the great thing about politics, right? It's kind of a game of chance because you can never play out the hand in advance. You never know how the cards are going to fall in a given election. So yes, for your viewers, my name is Don Carlson, native Rhode Islander. Grew up here, mostly in Jamestown and in Warwick, where my dad lived. Went through public high school and all my public K through 12 all my life. And got a great education in public schools in Rhode Island. Great enough to win a great scholarship, as I talked about, and go to some great schools afterwards. So very grateful for my childhood here. I learned to sail on that beach right over there, here in East Ferry, Jamestown, and had a great growing up time here. And it's my time of life now. I feel like it's a really good time to put my skills and talents to work for Rhode Island to make it a better place to live. So you can find me at carlsonforrhodeisland.com. carlsonforrhodeisland.com, and you can go on and check out my website. I think we're doing some upgrades to it today to put a little more depth of policy on there, especially in the educational arena. And you can also donate to the campaign. As you know, Pat, I'm an outsider to politics. I've been in and around politics and worked for other candidates for a long time, but I haven't actually run for anything myself. So I have a big job to do, a big hill to climb to introduce myself to the voters of Rhode Island, and that takes resources. So if you'd like to kick in on that, you'll find a link on that page to kick in a contribution. I'd be deeply grateful.
Thank you so much. We'll talk again soon.
Okay, thanks, Pat.